Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traore seems to be online everywhere all the time. In much of the material, he's lionised as the young king of Africa, but there's clearly fakery involved. This is Africa Here and Now. I'm Martine Dennis. Donu and Patrick are with me, and joining us is the renowned investigative journalist David Hundeyin. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Now, Ibrahim Traore has come to kind of personify, hasn't he, the zeitgeist? He's fulfilling the yearning of Africans and diasporans to be rid of Western powers and the infrastructure of the colonialists, as well as their own incompetent leaders. So he's actually fulfilling a deep desire on the continent, isn't he?
I think the general idea behind the groundswell of support for Ibrahim Traore is that he represents a total break from the status quo. Bear in mind, the median age across Africa is something like 18.9. In a country like Nigeria, the median age actually goes down to 16.9. So statistically, Africa is a majority Gen Z continent, which paradoxically is led by some of the world's oldest leaders. So there's always been this huge generational gap between the governed and the governing class in Africa. But here you have a guy who's 37 years old, who in many ways has a lot more in common with the typical African, if there's such a thing, than the political class that they've gotten used to. So there's that idea that this person represents a break from the status quo. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that the reason for the general groundswell of support is necessarily because the anti-colonial aspect of it is necessarily that well understood. But I definitely do think that just the fact that he represents some sort of a switch from the status quo in and of itself is pushing a lot of this energy.
So it's a matter of the youthfulness of this guy, the youngest leader in the world, I think. He's only about 37, I think, by now. But it's also about his statements, isn't it? His program, which is about resource nationalism, for instance.
Well, again, I'm not entirely convinced that the vast majority of the continental population necessarily even understands those issues, even though, so people like us have those conversations, and people like us definitely do care about such things. But I'm not convinced that your average 22-year-old growing up in Lagos knows, even understands what the concept of like neo-colonialism or anything like that is. I don't think they necessarily understand that, and I stand to be corrected there. But what I do think they see is a young man who seems to have the right motivations for being in power. They can see very clearly based on the news coming out of there, based on eyewitness accounts from people who visit, based on a lot of the narratives surrounding Burkina Faso. They can tell that this is someone whose priority in power actually appears to be putting shovels in the ground for the benefit of the population of that country, which is something that they or most Africans simply cannot relate to, because the leadership in their countries exists for a completely different purpose. I think they just see their leaders as bad people or as incompetent people, and they see a young man in Burkina Faso who appears to be patriotic and who appears to have some base level of competence. I think that's as much as they can see, to be honest, and I stand to be corrected.
This social media campaign, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I started off by saying that everything Traore is online all the time. How much effort is he himself, Ibrahim Traore, and his government, how much effort are they putting into this social media campaign?
Paradoxically, I actually think they're not putting in enough effort. And the reason I say that is that a lot of this social media narrative surrounding them is not controlled by them. A lot of it is controlled by sort of enthusiastic third parties who, in some cases, are well intentioned, but like they go way overboard, and that's where you get a lot of these like AI generated videos and like incredible visuals from places around the world, that people are claiming that this is some fantastic revolution taking place in Burkina Faso. You see housing developments from northern Algeria being presented as this is happening in Burkina Faso. And these things are very easy to disprove and discredit. So from the point of view of the Burkinabe government, these are actually not good things. So I think they're actually not putting in enough efforts in controlling and dominating their own narrative. They're especially in the Anglophone space. They're very, for whatever reason, they seem to be very willing to cede the information space to whoever wants to have it, which I personally don't really understand. They seem to be focused primarily on communicating within the francophone space and not just francophone. They're local, focused on the local. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's later this year that the Sahelian Alliance is planning to launch a radio and TV station that is supposed to have a global audience. If I'm not mistaken, this will be the first time that both that be it Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger, that they will be making any attempt to tell their story on a macro scale. But even in saying that, I was still quite surprised to find out that even this planned broadcast platform is planned to be dominated primarily by French language, which I think is a strategic mistake. I think the language of the internet is English. The most spoken language in the world is English. Um, and I just think it would be more pragmatic to, if you one was trying to control the narrative, to project in English, the same way Iran does with Press TV, the same way Russia does with RT, the same way France does with France 24.
I'll just repeat what you said earlier. Absolutely flabbergasted by the global hype. Some videos of celebrities weeping and singing hymns and begging God to save our Messiah. And it's my view about the whole thing is, I mean, I'm naturally skeptical anyway. So even if I didn't have information, which indicates that Traore is not quite as saintly as people think, and that there's some repression going on around issues like journalists being bullied and within Burkina Faso. So even if I didn't have that information, I'd be very suspicious about all this hype. Um, and what I wanted to say though is I understand it because I think Black people are desperate for heroes. We need heroes, and I was one of the biggest fans of Traore initially because I wanted this handsome, bold young man to be the savior that, at least of part of Africa, that we all yearn for. David, do you agree with me that this has more to do with people yearning for a hero and a savior than to do with the reality of Traore's actual performance and conduct within Burkina Faso?
So yes and no. Yes, to the extent that, as I said earlier, I feel like a lot of the actual foundational issues that even led to Traore seizing power, I feel like a lot of Africans don't necessarily even understand those issues. All they see is a young man who wants to develop his country, and that's the very simple and easy narrative. But no, in the sense that I disagree with the the notion that due to uh, as you said, some repression of the civic space, of journalism space, or other issues like that, um, that diminishes the work that the Traore government is responsible for. Um, I think that, again, this is a very sensitive topic, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. I think that um, the standards that Traore should be judged by, I think, are determined by the circumstances or the context that he exists in. Um, Prior to when he took power in 2022, first of all, the government he took power from was itself a military government, which also came in via a coup. The government before that, which was the government of Blaise Compaoré, which came into power also via a coup, um, in which the arguably the most consequential leader in Burkina Faso's history, Thomas Sankara, was murdered. So coming from that context, I don't believe that where you have for 60 plus years, every time the IMF or the World Bank puts out those annual lists, the world's greatest economies, the world's poorest countries, And Burkina Faso has consistently been in the bottom five for like 60 plus years. And nobody ever had anything to say, good or bad, about Burkina Faso. Nobody cared. It was just a completely irrelevant, unimportant little bit of Sahelian landlocked land somewhere in West Africa. Nobody cared. Then all of a sudden, Ibrahim Traore comes in, and all of a sudden, everybody is supposed to care now that, oh, there's some repression going on, there's this going on. And my perspective on this is, why did none of this matter 4 years ago? Why does it matter now? Who does it matter to, and whose narrative is being pushed here? That's what I'm more concerned about, because one thing I've been very harshly introduced to over the past 5 years is that there is no such thing as objectivity as far as global narratives or global media or global journalism is concerned. There's a purpose for every bit of information that is put out there. So if I am being told that this guy is a repressive dictator, is a strongman, authoritarian, yada, 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 okay. Who is telling me this and why? That's what I'm more interested in. And what economic and geopolitical interests are served by this narrative becoming mainstream? The reason I have this position now is, I mean, as recently as 2011, during the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, I considered myself as a 21-year-old university student to be, to be an intelligent, enlightened person. And I celebrated the downfall of Gaddafi. He's a strong man, the dictator who's been overthrown in a revolution. Happy days. What's not to like about that? And in the intervening decade and a half, I've been introduced very harshly to the reality that the world is not divided into black and white. The world is not divided into democracy and dictatorship. That is a false paradigm that does not exist. I've been forced to admit to myself that Muammar Gaddafi, with all his foibles and with all the things, negative things that could be said about him, was definitely Africa was definitely better off with a Muammar Gaddafi than without a Muammar Gaddafi and the current state that Libya is in. So whenever I see these narratives being promulgated against anyone on the African continent, that this is, and this is the same standard, the same metric by which I now judge people like even Paul Kagame. Because a few years ago, I was a very, very, very sort of vocal critic of this guy. This guy is a repressive authoritarian. This guy's political enemies, they disappear or they get thrown into jail. Journalism doesn't really exist in Rwanda. He wins elections with 90% of the vote. It's a joke government of a joke country. These are very, very simple narratives. But again, the historical context, which I wasn't acknowledging then, was that the alternative to this strong man who actually runs a functional country now, or something approaching a functional country, the alternative to that, given the historical context that existed then, will be something that will be much, much, much worse. So I believe that Ibrahim Traore should be judged primarily on the outcomes of his government for Burkinabe, the Human Development Index of Burkina Faso. He has said openly that within the next 5 years, that there are certain metrics that he should be judged on within the next 5 years. For example, they've said every year they want to tarmac a minimum of 5,000 kilometers of roads every year. Given that since 1960, the whole country only had 3,000 kilometers of tarmac roads. They've said that there are certain healthcare outcomes, certain education outcomes. If those outcomes are accomplished within the time frame that he has set for himself, then I think the verdict would be, from my point of view, that he has delivered on his remit. He has done what he said he would do. I don't believe that the metric for good leadership is whether journalists are allowed to do their job or not. I, I simply don't believe it. I think that's journalists.
But David, what about elections, holding elections? Is that important? Is democracy important?
Again, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. What I will say to that is that Nigeria supposedly held elections in 2023. The person who is now the president of Nigeria supposedly came into power through an election. The person who is president in Kenya came into power through an election, right? So they're both democratically elected. The person who is in power in Kenya had a case at the International Criminal Court, a case which only went under when all the witnesses started turning up dead one by one. That's a democratically elected president of one of Africa's most consequential countries, right? So, I no longer believe in these false dichotomies that governance is divided into democracy and authoritarianism. Democracy is the gold standard, and authoritarianism is evil, right? China is an authoritarian country, right? I don't believe that I would be that as a human being, I would enjoy a better standard of life or greater amount of freedom in Nigeria than in China. Nigeria holds elections. China doesn't. Nigeria has multi-party democracy. China doesn't. It's a one-party state. But China is clearly a much better country and a much better society and offers a much greater standard of individual freedom to its citizens. I believe that the definition of freedom that a lot of us in the civic space operate with is a definition that has been given to us by this sort of American controlled civil society narrative, which is that freedom is determined primarily by freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech, those very nice sounding concepts. I no longer believe that. I believe that the most important freedom now that must be had for any other type of freedom to exist and thrive is economic freedom, right? So if you live in a country which, like Nigeria, has a human development index of 0.4, 0.5, or you claim to have all these freedoms, then I think you're fooling yourself. As against being in a country like China, which might have 0.8, 0.9, but doesn't have some of these freedoms. How free is a poor person in Africa, really?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wholly with you, David, on the issue of the polarities. I mean, people are taking these positions that are kind of ridiculous because, as we see, the so-called representative democratic model in the West is really under attack like it's never been for 50 years, and a lot of hypocrisy, double standards are being exposed in the course of that. How many Burkinabe voices have we heard? Because I have been in the neighboring countries. I haven't been in Burkina Faso since Traore took over. I've spoken to numerous people from Burkina Faso. Some are in exile, some are activists, and they tell me that the repression is not simply a matter of a little bit of teasing of journalists and restricting of journalists. It is absolutely the destruction of independent thinking and debate within the society, mediated through the media and universities and so forth. Civil society has been comprehensively closed down. Journalists who go up against the Traore regime are either detained or sent to the war front. Sometimes people over 50 are sent to the war front. So those are things that are going on. Now, when you mention about the metrics you intend to judge Traore by, what about the security issue? It is now said, and it'd be interesting if you could respond to that less than a third of the country is now controlled by his regime, and that the level of security in the country has deteriorated sharply since the initial coup against the Kabore regime. So I think that is a very important issue to delve into, and who these jihadists are, and who's backing them, and what the government's response is. And the response I've heard from Burkinabe, that instead of dealing with the social and political issues that are fostering the support base of the jihadis, there has been a tendency by the regime to victimize the Pearl people, the Fulani people, and to run a kind of an ethnic-based campaign against this. So none of that to me sounds like it's very progressive or in favor of a more stable and more prosperous country. And that's coming from Burkinabe. Now, they could all be paid agents of the Quai d'Orsay and the Elysee Palace and Donald Trump. But I think we're not hearing that voice at all. None of this propaganda that's put out from Traore are we hearing it from Burkinabe people themselves? It's by people who seem to think they know what's going on. So I think there's a real credibility problem.
So again, this is this is not me offering myself up as a representative of Ibrahim Traore's government. I've never even spoken one on one to someone who works within Traore's government. I'm speaking purely as someone who sits as an observer, looking from the outside in. What I will say is, first of all, Burkinabe speak French. So obviously there's a huge language barrier. So if we're not hearing so much from the Burkinabes themselves, maybe it's because we don't speak French. Because as I'm made to understand, there is quite a thriving.
This is from French friends that are francophone friends. This is not just an English French thing. In the francophone media, we're not hearing a lot of Burkinabe voices.
You're going to have to pardon me for this, but to be honest, um, any information coming out of France, specifically French government influenced information, be that the state media or be that the sort of state influenced media like Agence France Press, RFI, or Jeune Afrique, to be honest, I don't take it seriously. And that's because I've seen how these people operate up close. I simply don't trust the journalism that comes out of France. I take it as seriously as I take journalism that comes out of Nigeria. It's state controlled propaganda.
I'm not saying it's coming out of France, but coming out from francophone Africans in the region.
Again, so one question that I want to ask is if Ibrahim Traore was all of this, right, as he described him, but instead of being sort of Pan Africanist aligned, or some would argue Russian aligned, if he was fully French and Western aligned, would we have heard a single thing? And for me, that's the most important question. Who is talking about these things and why?
Well, I would hope we would have. I mean, that's what journalism is about, just trying to find out what the hell's going on, trying to test facts and information.
Well, in that case, if that were the case, we will be hearing a lot coming out of the likes of Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon, which are a hop and a skip away. We'll be hearing a lot coming out of Gabon, right? We literally had Trump's special advisor, whatever it is for Africa, Massad Boulos, taking a picture with the coup leader in Gabon a few days ago, a coup leader who transitioned himself into a civilian president with 92% of the vote.
Yeah, but David, that's Trump. Okay?
And the US government sent a representative to take a picture with him, and he tweeted that this is a democratic milestone for Gabon. So if it's a democratic milestone for Gabon, for a coup leader to arrogate 92% of the supposed vote to himself in a sham election and become a civilian president, but it's not a democratic milestone for Ibrahim Traore to be a transitional leader in Burkina Faso, then you can see where I'm going with it.
But he's just awarded himself another 5 years in power. On what authority did he do that?
On what authority did Alassane Ouattara do the same thing in Cote d'Ivoire? Because he's just modified the constitution.
Yeah, but we complain about Ouattara as well.
I know. I mean, that's what I'm saying about this thing of polarities. It doesn't make it. Ouattara taking an illegal fourth term, maybe fifth term, whatever, doesn't is wrong. It doesn't make what Traore does being right, does it?
No, David, you are wrong. David, there are journalists and publications that have focused on other African leaders and European leaders, like those awful right wingers in Eastern Europe, in Hungary or wherever. So, you can't get away with this whataboutism.
The point is, why is the focus on Ibrahim Traore and not on people who have been doing the same thing for many, many, many more years?
Well, it should be on both. I agree. It should be on both. Yeah.
Some of us have complained about bad leaders in Africa, outside Africa, and if Traore is sliding into that territory, we complain about him too. You can't. I don't believe in moral relativism. At least, well, I don't believe in it in theory, and I am guilty of it when it comes to Kagame, for example. Whenever Kagame is attacked, I say, well, at least he's running the country efficiently, unlike a lot of African leaders who are dictators and useless, you know? So I think we have to be honest and say, bad is bad, whoever does it, you know? And it's not fair or true to say that nobody condemns Ouattara or others. There's been plenty of complaints about Tinubu, for example. David, you and me, I just wrote a column in Vanguard abusing Tinubu. It's in Vanguard today. So, but I hear you about things like the whole democracy hype thing and Africa and, must we follow the Western model slavishly? But, I cannot be persuaded that Gaddafi was okay just because other people were bad as well.
Well, I mean, again, it's it's very, and I'm trying very hard not to frame this as though this is me standing in the gap for some certain group of people, because I'm not. I don't have any horse in this race. My issue here is, as someone who used to hold the same kind of position that you do over the past few years. Um, my interaction with sort of the wider world has made it very clear to me that these are not the standards by which the real world operates. The real world doesn't really care about whether something, the concepts of good or bad, those concepts don't exist in the real world. The people who control the real world are those people live in Paris, they live in Brussels, they live in London, live in DC. The people who hold real power in the world are some of the most ruthlessly amoral people in the world.
Well, who does? Who does?
If you're trying to survive in a world whose parameters have been defined by those people, I think it's naive at best to then frame, one's perspectives from the point of view of this person is good, this person is not good. Was Barack Obama a good person? You could argue back and forth about it every day. Was Winston Churchill a good person? So Muammar Gaddafi doesn't have to be a good person. I mean, he probably wasn't. But from my point of view, did his interests align with mine in the larger scheme of things? Yes, he meddled a lot in West African politics. Yes, he funded civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where he was defeated by the Nigerians, I might add. Yes, he did a lot of geopolitical meddling across the continent. But in the large, when examined from a wider angle, was was Africa better off with a Gaddafi or without a Gaddafi, with all of his foibles? And I think history has given a very clear verdict on that. That there's no amount of damage and destruction that Gaddafi caused, which was a fraction of that which has happened since he was violently deposed by external forces.
David, I mean, I hear what you're saying on all these issues, and I'm in accord with a lot of what you're saying, and that's why I think when you talk about the interests, it's be worth to have a critical Pan African look at what is going on in Burkina Faso. What is going on with the security? Why are these agencies saying that the place is less secure uh, now than it was before Traore took over? What about the allegations of grand corruption? What about the allegations? And I was a journalist. Obviously, I'm going to say that I regard the detention of human rights activists and journalists, their torture, and some being sent to the war front. I think that is a serious issue, and I think any government that does that sort of thing, whether it's the British government, whether it's the Russian government or the French government, they need to be held to account for it.
Can we get back to the point in hand, and that is that there is perhaps the most extensive, comprehensive social media campaign being waged on behalf of Ibrahim Traore, inadvertently perhaps undermining Traore himself, his government, and indeed Burkina Faso. But can we get back to the fact that the worry is that the distinction between fact and fiction is being blurred, and Africans are being almost deliberately muddled, which I think is a particularly bad thing, David?
Well, again, I think it boils down to the problem that the Burkinabe government doesn't seem to be willing to dominate its own narrative. It's willing to cede the territory to other people. In addition to these sort of overzealous characters that I've made reference to, I actually believe, even though I obviously can't prove it because you're not going to get any written record of it, but I actually believe that there's possibly foreign state involvement in this as well, specifically French state involvement in this as well, because if you agree that there is an information war going on, then um, I guess what could be a more effective way of thoroughly discrediting an administration or a government or an individual than by putting out a bunch of fantastical narratives that are very, very easy to debunk and discredit, to the end goal of eventually casting doubt on everything that comes out of a particular place.
Precisely. Like the Beyonce video that Donu you referred to earlier, where it's obviously AI. She is crying and lamenting, and almost it's a prayer, isn't it, to save a demigod almost. Which again, we're getting into very, very dangerous territory, aren't we, with regard to the way social media is being manipulated, and it does not benefit Africans, I would suggest.
Cult of personality stuff is never good. It always ends badly.
Whether we want to admit it publicly or not, everyone has a side that they're on, right? The thing with me is that I've chosen to publicly own what side that I'm on, right? I've chosen, and this isn't coming from a place of sentiment, from a place of like emotional Pan-Africanism or something. This is coming from a place of cold, hard logic, because I have seen the global system that exists, and I have decided to pick a side. The side that I'm on is basically the side that is pro-African in the general geopolitical sense. Now, that side, as it currently exists, happens to align with what the governments in the Sahelian alliance are doing, or at least their publicly owned positions, which is why I might appear to be defending these guys or to be supporting these guys. But it's not from a place of emotional support or like these guys are heroes or something. But it's just a simple, cold, hard calculation for me that, to my mind, the primary issue in Africa is an issue of economic justice. It's an issue of economic independence. So I'm very sorry, but every other issue, I consider those issues to be secondary to that. As I said, I don't believe that a poor person can be free. I don't believe that a population of 200 million poor people can have, what's the word now? Can have good journalism, can have an independent media. Because currently in Nigeria, we will claim to have a free press and independent media. We have no such thing. What we have in Nigeria is a media ecosystem that is funded almost entirely from external sources. It's US intelligence money that is holding up Nigeria's entire press ecosystem. And we call that a free press, right? It's not. This idea that because something comes from the West makes it by default free or good is simply not true, right? The so called West is not a better society than the Chinese or the Russians that they love to hate on.
The way of cutting through this sort of aura of disinformation about Burkina Faso would be to get credible independent journalists going into Burkina Faso, looking and reporting on the security situation, on the management of the natural resources, and being given free access to the people of that country. Not Western stooges, not imperialist running dogs, but independent journalists, trained professional journalists such as yourself, going to the country and producing reports. And that would meet the question that we're all trying to get to the bottom of. Because that's not happening right now.
Well, the funny thing is, I actually agree with David. Everything he says about the press in Nigeria, it's true. But, we can't sweep that kind of nonsense under the carpet wherever it happens. And you, as a victim of a country in which there is no real freedom of expression, should be sensitive. What if you were a Burkinabe journalist? How would you like it if they packed you off to the war front because you had some questions to ask the head of state? You're not a stooge. I'm not a stooge. Lots of people are not stooges. How would you like it?
Is that a rhetorical question, or am I supposed to respond to that?
You do perfectly well what I'm asking you. Go on, answer. Oh yeah, answer.
I mean, so I definitely wouldn't like it if I were a journalist in Burkina Faso and I had to go to the war front. Definitely not. It's not in a journalist skill set to go fight jihadis. And also saying that, I think as a journalist in Burkina Faso, I would also have to be realistic enough with myself to read the room, to understand the situation, that there's a war going on. So In a war situation, and by the way, this is not something restricted to Burkina Faso. This happens in the US, this happens in the UK, this happens everywhere. In a situation of war, everything else becomes secondary. In the larger scheme of things, Burkina Faso is not a very important country. It's not a very powerful country in the larger scheme of things. So the fact that we're having a whole episode of this podcast talking about Ibrahim Traore, the government, the leader of a tiny landlocked country somewhere in the Sahel, and which until recently was one of the poorest countries in the world, I think says it all. Because there's never been anything close to this amount of scrutiny for much worse things than this that have happened both close to Burkina Faso within Africa and also outside of Africa. So it goes back to the question I asked at the beginning. In whose benefit is all this scrutiny happening? And I think as a journalist, if I were a journalist in Burkina Faso and I considered myself to be a good, intelligent, independent journalist, that's the first question I'd want to answer. That am I knowingly or unknowingly lending myself to be used as a tool in someone else's geopolitical calculation, someone else's war game? Or am I doing something that is in the interests of the population that I claim to serve? Because again, journalism is not this abstraction hanging in the air. Journalism has a purpose. So if you're a journalist in Burkina Faso, I would imagine your goal is to ensure that the lives of your fellow citizens become better. So that being the case, if you don't believe that Ibrahim Traore's government is doing the right things, if you don't believe that Ibrahim Traore's government is making the lives of Burkinabes better, then that's perfectly fine. Follow your conscience. Do exactly like I have done. But if the motivation for going after Ibrahim Traore or subjecting him to these incredible levels of scrutiny is that you somehow believe that, well, there's all this hero worshipping of this guy going on the African continent. So I have to sort of present a counter narrative. I have to look at the other side of it. Like, this is not a game. This is real life, right? And other people make pragmatic decisions. I think Africans are allowed to make pragmatic decisions too. Other people make selfish decisions. I don't think Africans have any duty to be selfless and, we are the world kind of thing. I believe that all Africans have the right to be just as geopolitically opportunistic and selfish as everyone else is on the planet. And I think we have 400 plus years of history showing what happens when we're not. So again, I'm not really apologetic about taking a side or picking a side on this issue. I simply don't believe that the scrutiny that Ibrahim Traore is supposed to be subjected to is coming from a place of sincerity. Maybe for people like Donu, it is coming from that place, but the vast majority of it is geopolitical theater, and I'm just not buying it.
And there we are going to end. Can I thank you all very much indeed? Well, that's it for this edition of Africa Here and Now. Please remember to like, subscribe and share. You know the drill by now. You can get us also on major audio platforms like Acast, Apple and Spotify. There's our website, AfricaHere&NOW.com. There you'll find all past episodes, plus some really interesting commentaries on important subjects. Get in touch. We're on all the socials. I'm at Martine Dennis on X. We recorded this show on Friday the 9th of May 2025. Our fabulous original music is by Emric Adam. Anne Busby is our producer. Tevin Sudi put it all together. Our thanks to David Hundeyin, and from Donu, Patrick and me, thank you for your company.